Hello and welcome to my new series, Missed Information, MISSED. Today we have Joe Martino, who's an investigative journalist, a filmmaker, and the founder of The Pulse and Collective Evolution, two media companies. Thank you so much for joining me, Joe. I'm so excited about this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited for it as well. It's always fun to talk about this stuff. So I think there's a lot of meaningful takeaways here.
Yeah, and you're a fellow Canadian, which is exciting for me as well. It's hopeful to talk to somebody who you really did create a media company from the ground up. And I'm really curious, how did you come to do this?
Yeah, so it's funny, the idea of being a journalist, so to speak, is something I resisted for a long time because I never saw myself as wanting to be a journalist. As a kid, kind of coming out of elementary school, hopping into high school, having very little interest in school while I was there, kind of always wanted to work with my hands or play around with things, be creative in that regard. I love sports. I love being active, right? But I never really was like, yeah, I want to dive into like investigating all this meaningful stuff going on in the world. I kind of more so had just philosophical ideas that ask questions. Why are we doing this as humans? Like, I don't understand. If man created the world, can't we just like uncreate it and create something different? Like, all of our systems and structures are just agreements that we're working with. And as I sort of went out of high school and went into college or university, I was in and out of different programs, kept dropping out of different programs, never found something I was interested in. I did anything from engineering to marketing, business. I did, music production, kind of did everything a little bit. And at the end of the day, the answer for me was to drop out, to not be there, and take a different path. And so I did. And as I did that, I sort of gave myself permission to sort of step off the beaten path, if you will. So that was both in how I chose to live my life, but also I started to reflect a lot within myself. Where did my ideas come from? Why do I feel the way I do? Or, what's kind of going on within myself? How do I find a sense of peace, a sense of well-being? And through that journey, I learned a lot about the exploration of my own consciousness and my own, state of being, state of wellness. And that inevitably sort of overlapped with the observation of what's going on in the world. And that overlap is kind of what inspired the creation of Collective Evolution to begin with back in 2009, which was saying, let's start talking about this apparent change that's happening in the world. People are seeking, they're ready for a change in something. We might not know where to start or exactly what we're feeling. We're kind of working that out, but let's have a conversation. Let's see what's going on. Let's look at how our world really functions. Let's look at and ask questions about how we function. And let's see if we can kind of re-examine the foundation of what we believe about how we should live our lives. And so that's kind of how it all started with Collective Evolution.
So can you give us a summary of what the 12 years has looked like?
Yeah, for sure. So the first couple of years, we were just finding our ground. It was more of like, hey, let's just blog different ideas. It was a lot in the sort of personal transformation or spiritual discussion, philosophical discussion, just exploring different ideas in that realm. And the more that happened, the more it led to current events, because you start to ask the question, these philosophical questions or beliefs that we often have are the foundation to which we build our society off of, right? It's where the individual agreements that we make about how we're going to, exchange money, or how we should run an economy, or how we should live in family structures, all this sort of stuff just comes from, different ideas. So inevitably it went into current events. So we started to talk more about current events. And in the discussion of current events, we decided to look a little bit deeper, right? We decided to understand that there are certain things that are happening in the world that might be missed, as you mentioned, but at the same time that are almost unacknowledged, like they're conspiracies that are said to be conspiracies, but over the course of time, we start to realize, no, these things are actually happening. Maybe not every single conspiracy, but some of these things are actually happening, but we're not talking about them. And so people don't know what's happening. And yet the sort of the secrecy around some of these ideas have a massive amount of impact on our society and the way it operates. So inevitably, we started looking at some of that stuff as well. And over the years, I would say by around 2013, like we had already made a couple documentaries at that point. And we really started to find a good flow of information and how we were going to create our journalism and stuff moving forward. We sort of came up with a new idea, a new way of presenting news and media that kind of took some more of a well-being in mind a little bit, a deeper introspection a little bit in mind. And it was probably around that time, 2012, 2013, that we really started to grow a lot as a result, because we were really sort of meeting the discussion as to where people were at, in a sense, which meant to say, really acknowledging we do have a lot of questions, we're not sure what's going on, and instead of purely philosophical, we were relating that philosophy to everyday life. And the more we did that, the more it grew. And from 2013 into 2014 and 2015, things grew very, very rapidly. We had millions and millions and millions of people we were reaching every single month. And it got to a point where somebody actually just brought this up on YouTube the other day. They were like, I miss when you guys had such a massive influence over conversation, because it meant that, more people were seeing and in tune with some of these deeper questions and deeper ideas. And, they had said, like, I hope that it rebuilds back to that point. And that's kind of where it went from 2013, 2014, 2015. To be honest, our platform was very, very large. We were reaching, 20, 30 million people a month quite easily. And that was just on the website. I mean, our Facebook page and our YouTube and all that sort of stuff would have been even more people that were seeing our content. And then in and around 2016, the tail end of it, right, that was leading into the presidential campaign where sort of Hillary and Trump were going at each other. And people might think, well, why is that important? Well, what seemed important about that is Trump sort of represented a bit of a different character that we don't typically see in running for president, if you will. And at the same time, WikiLeaks was sort of they were seeing collaboration at that time with mainstream media. And not on all stories, but on some stories. And so WikiLeaks had sort of grown to be appreciated and acknowledged by a mainstream audience. But then WikiLeaks did something interesting where they started to actually leak information at the time about Hillary Clinton, which was obviously very damning to her campaign, very damning to her public image. And of course, at that point, mainstream media sort of distanced itself from WikiLeaks. And it's interesting because that moment is so important, because we saw the changing of a culture, the changing of a guard, where these really powerful elite figures were now able to be held accountable to some extent by an alternative media or an independent media that couldn't be controlled so easily. And as the presidential race went on and more damning information came up about Hillary Clinton, and of course there was stuff out there about Trump as well, but it wasn't like the mainstream media could just shut down all conversation, because alternative media had just as loud, perhaps even louder of a voice. So this was the first time people were hearing, I would argue, at least in my lifetime, balanced perspectives. They were hearing both sides, or both the messiness that comes with each of the candidates. And that was unusual in a sense, right? So we saw, as soon as Trump got elected, 6 days later, so as soon as the election was won by Trump, 6 days later, a list came out. And that list was written by some university figure, professor who had done, in essence, a study gathering data from all these different online sources. And this sort of became the fake news list. And the list, I mean, you could pull it up at some point, but it's really this sort of, this almost like an Excel sheet of all the different names of the websites, sort of how they classified them, and then, almost a small discussion as to around like whether you should trust them or not, right? And of course you shouldn't for anybody on the list, but there was different classifications. These people are outright, it's just fake news. It's not real at all. These people just produce humor. They, don't take it seriously because it's just laughable, right? And then these people over here do things like, they use clickbait content. They're just trying to bait people into clicking, but somehow they're on the fake news list, right? And we managed to make this list as we create clickbait content. So even though our titles were identical to the titles you see in mainstream media, we somehow made this do not trust this brand list. And that list became the mainstream discussion that started to erode some of the trust and started to create the divide between the alternative media and the mainstream media. We saw Trump talking a lot about, oh, you're fake news, you're this, you're that, whatever. Then the idea of fake news began to rise in a really, really big way. And it was at that point that censorship and our reach of 20, 30 million people a month started to go down the tubes very quickly, because specifically Facebook started to censor everything. And that's kind of where, at that point, it kind of just continually 20, 30% a year, somewhere in that range, we would lose more and more and more of our reach of our audience through social media platforms, till eventually we hit in 2020, we were removed almost entirely from Google's search console. And we've released all the data on all this stuff to show people what has gone on, just from a very empirical point of view. Just how we've been removed from the search console, how YouTube shut off all of our viewership, just everything we had built for years and years and years and years off of good, integral, sourced information. So we weren't the websites on that list that were producing false information. We weren't the websites on that list that were producing satirical information. We were just lumped together with them because they couldn't find a way to erode trust in our brand. This is my theory, right? They couldn't find a way to erode trust in our brand, so we got lumped in with these non-trustworthy. Look, they're getting visitors to their website with clickbait. How could you trust that, right? It was silly, right? It was sort of like this immature knee-jerk reaction from a mainstream culture that was losing control over a narrative. And so that's kind of where we're at today with CE is it reached a point where we had to explore the idea of creating a new brand.
Right, so let's touch on that. So you made it on this list. Let's go back a bit. What are some things that you were talking about years ago that people might have thought, oh, this is a little bit out there, that are now mainstream and hitting the mainstream now?
For sure. So one of the big ones is UFOs. And the other one I'll throw in there very large. There's two other ones. I mean, GMO, the discussion around GMOs, are they safe? Are they good for the environment? Are they going to create killer bugs, killer weeds? Like what's going on there? Are they nutritious? We took a very science-oriented approach way back in the day about GMOs. We were considered to be batshit crazy for it. As time has gone on, obviously that discussion has become a lot more mainstream. There's a lot more people who are understanding the challenges with GMOs and the problems that it's causing. But back then it was almost like, no, you guys are just fear-mongering, conspiracy, la-di-da-da-da. But I mean, now you see some of the most celebrated organizations and companies out there are people that are trying to protect the food source and protect it from a standpoint of, no, we need good soil, natural food that's well made, all that sort of stuff. And people, celebrate that now. But, if it wasn't for brands like us, really saying, no, we need to talk about this and getting flack for it, I don't know how much that conversation would have grown, because we hit millions and millions and millions and millions of people with that. So that was one of them. Another one is the vaccine discussion. Now, I know this is, for a lot of people, one of the most controversial discussions. I think bar none, the biggest reason why the vaccine discussion is controversial is people misunderstand what's going on because it has been mischaracterized. I can tell you right now, the vast majority of people out there that are questioning vaccines are not thinking that every single vaccine is designed to kill people, or that every single vaccine is super, super dangerous and like, oh my God, and it's the cause for. Most of them are going, hold on a second, like very similar to certain drugs that have made it through the pharmaceutical process of approval that then were introduced to people, that then were given to people for 10 or 20 years, that, they had a market, but it wasn't a massive market. And then it came out later that, well, actually that drug was harming a lot of people. And when I say a lot, I mean maybe 10% of people, maybe 15% of people that were taking them, and they pulled them off the market. Oops, maybe we shouldn't have put this one out there. Well, if you look at the data, if you look at the science, you look at what people are putting forward, they're trying to have a conversation that looks somewhat similar, that says, look, there are some issues here. We don't know entirely what they all are, but there's something going on. And yes, there is an extreme side to this where people are very like, oh, the government's trying to depopulate everybody. And then there's the sort of the side of it where it's just like, let's take a grounded look at this, because the science is suggesting that perhaps 10%, perhaps 15% of people, especially kids, when you're giving them a specific age and the amount that they're being given, they might be having unintended long-term effects on that's producing chronic illness in kids. A lot of the popular chronic illnesses that we see today, like allergies and like potentially things related to the gut, related to the brain, right? Which is kind of where people make the autism link, right? So we're seeing some of that stuff. And that conversation back then, you were absolutely crazy to talk about it. Whereas it started to build. And if you look at it and you don't get sort of misled by the mischaracterization around the questioning, you'll realize that there is a massive amount of doctors and scientists that are not crazy, that are just well-intended people that probably vaccinated their kids, that might be, be vaccinated fully themselves, so on and so forth, that are saying, hold on a second, like, no, there is something here. We need to talk about this, right? And that has built and has grown. And then with COVID, it has also become a very large discussion, because now we're rush vaccinating a large portion of the population with something that, yes, it has been around for a little while. mRNA technology has been around for almost like 30 years, but they haven't been done en masse. They've been used for gene therapies and stuff like that on a very small level, but not en masse. And so we don't really know what to expect. We're already seeing a lot of issues, and people are just saying, hold on, let's figure this out. And then of course UFOs, which I'll briefly touch on. I mean, we talked about that. We were fringe, we were batshit crazy, whatever. We lost so much respect from people for talking about UFOs. Now, I mean, we don't need to, tell that story. We already know what's going on there.
Yeah, that's hitting mainstream big. And ironically, people aren't really talking about it like they are, but they're not. It's not like there's a big uproar of like, this is ridiculous. It's like, yeah. Oh, there's lots of stuff going on. Okay, UFOs, cool.
Yeah, because there's a part of people that almost feels like, well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of self-explanatory, maybe. I mean, it kind of feels like this is probably true. Maybe we don't know all the details, but it's probably true, And
there's lots of theories with it. There's lots of like, there's technologies that the military are way advanced in. And so it might just be us, yep. Might be not us. So interesting. It's interesting when you're talking about vaccinations, I felt this discomfort inside my chest, because I was like, someone is going to stop watching this interview right here.
Yeah.
Even though Joe is totally being balanced, totally just stating facts and just explaining what's going on. Someone is going to be majorly fired up listening to this, which is so fascinating. Why do you think we can't even talk about things right now in these more intense things?
Yeah, I mean, that's a deep question that probably has multiple factors, which inevitably I'm probably going to miss touching on one or two of them. But I can throw down a lot of thoughts and ideas, because we've thought about this a lot over the years, and we've developed our media to address this very real reality. Like I was saying in an earlier piece of content I was creating today, it's like, I legitimately care about people, community, the world. Like I legitimately do. And so for that reason, I seek to understand, what is it that makes us tick? What is it that makes us aggressively avoid information? Instead of me looking at somebody who disagrees with me or that might have an extreme view and saying, well, these people are crazy, these people are horrible, these people are bad, or they're racist, they're just horrible. I like to ask, what led to that? What's going on? How can we explore that? Because it's when we start asking those questions, we start getting to the core of how we can solve the challenges that we face, of how we can get people more in touch with themselves, to perhaps question within themselves how they arrived at those ideas. Because our society today isn't really asking those questions a whole lot. We're more so making a lot of judgment statements around who's right and who's wrong, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. People are told based on their political affiliation how they should think, what they should believe in, who they should listen to, who they shouldn't. And these are all obviously big problems, because it sort of allows the external world to define everything about who you are as a person, as opposed to really getting to know who we are on a deeper level. And it also seeks, in maybe an intentional way, maybe it's not intentional, but it seeks to sort of create this lack of connection between society, where now we might not talk, or we might not have a conversation, because the media has told me that it's more than likely that you're crazy because you're a Republican and I listen to left-leaning media. Therefore, I know everything about you without talking to you, because the media told me what you're like. And these are obviously huge challenges that we're facing, and it's why we're continually seeing that divide. But to really kind of look at it and say, like, how do we arrive at this? How did we get here? How does this play into the vaccine discussion? It's that same thing. It's like, we look at media, we look at mass culture, we look at sort of what's happened, and this culture of the disconnection, this culture of not seeking to understand the deeper stuff, but more so to align with just the straight mental, the material, physical self of who we think we are and all that we identify with, has created in response this, well, we always have to attack the enemy. Well, we always just have to protect our side. We always just have to protect our ideology. Well, we always just have to kind of put this out there. There's not really much balance in mainstream media anymore. And so as a result, we're educating people based on unbalanced information that isn't actually seeking to connect people. They might say that in their commercial or in their about section, but it's not what's happening on the platform, right? Like it's very, very echo chambery driven, drive people apart. And, so ultimately I think what we're sort of seeing here is sort of a massive, I guess, gap, a massive void that is happening, that's just driving people further and further apart, so we don't understand each other and we can't talk about things because we're continually told that the other side is dangerous. We're continually told that the other side is part of the problem. And because people aren't given the full breadth, the balance of what's happening, they assume that there is no other side. So for somebody to have a different perspective means they're, almost insane, in a sense. And perhaps that's oversimplifying it a little bit, but it stems around these ideas, in my observation.
Yeah, I see a lot of people, they think that they've looked into both sides, but what they've done is they've heard commentary from the side they've already agreed on talking about the other side.
Yes.
Which is not actually looking into both sides. I started looking, and it was uncomfortable. I started looking for people who I actually liked, like I had on social media, like I vibed with them in some way, that believed different things than me.
Yes.
That's kind of how I went about it. It's not finding someone you don't like who believes different things than you. You have to kind of put yourself in that in-between where, hey, I'd actually have a drink with this person and be friends with them.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hear what they believe, right?
100%. Like we have a course in our members area, all about critical thinking and improving sort of this side of things, right? And one of the exercises is very much that. Like if you have an issue and you don't know how to argue what the other side would actually say about that issue, it more than likely means you don't understand the entirety of the issue. And does it mean you're a bad person? No, it just means that you probably haven't actually looked into it and understood and empathized and connected with where those people are coming from. And thus you probably also have maybe a sort of a characterization of them that says like, well, they're just crazy, which is why they believe that, or they're just a leftist, or they're just a crazy Republican or a conservative, which is why they believe that, right? And so that's a very important thing to do, is connect with people that, you can find some commonality with and see where things overlap or challenge each other's ideas.
I really like that you bring that up because I've been talking about that too. If you can't talk about and empathize with the other person, even if you don't agree with them, if you can't say, okay, this is maybe how they're thinking, then you're probably the one that doesn't have the full picture. Mm-hmm. If you're able to just think that person's crazy and write them off, then you probably haven't done the research to empathize correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And this is where it sort of comes, one of the things that happens a lot in the media space is you'll hear from people, and I totally understand this, I don't have the time. How am I supposed to, understand what's going on every side of things? How am I supposed to pay attention? Like sometimes, I'm just worried about putting food on the table for my kids. I'm worried about working. I'm worried about doing those things. Plus, sometimes, the media can be draining. There's so much stuff out there that feels disheartening, and I don't know how to do it. And I feel like I'm more sane by just kind of taking a step back. And I would say, I agree with you on pretty much all those points. Like most of media can leave you very drained, which is why we chose to do it differently. We're trying to do something different that focuses on the deeper sense of well-being, being able to talk about subjects without leaving people in a state where they feel, oh my God, come on. You know what I'm saying? Like when we've ran surveys, we've surveyed, over 1,500 people at one point to gather a good understanding of how our media has impacted them over the years. And the vast majority of people say that it leaves them feeling inspired, it leaves them feeling empowered, as opposed to, feeling sort of down and out and everything's negative and everything's bad. And that to me comes with the way we chose to do things. Now, the other side to it is it's like the issue of there's so many different perspectives out there. Where am I supposed to find out what's going on? Again, I mean, we're sort of having to ask the question at some point, like, what are we, and this is difficult. I'm going to acknowledge that, but at some point in life, we have to ask the question, where is it that we're heading as a society? And at what cost is me choosing not to engage? At what cost is that going to have in the long run, right? People might say, well, I'm just focused on food on the table, this, that, whatever. And maybe that's literally all they can do. And I can understand that. At the same time, it's like, if we can't make 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 minutes for that, is it possible that, a cultural, authoritarian cultural government, which is kind of what we have almost globally at this point, they're leading humanity towards this ultra surveillance, ultra controlled, ultra totalitarian reality? Do you want to live in that? Because the cost might be that you're going to end up in that if you just allow this stuff to happen and stay disengaged from it. So it's not an easy thing to look at. It's not an easy thing to accept, but it's the reality that we're facing right now. It's very difficult if you take a balanced look at what's happening in the world. It's very difficult to say that we're not heading in that direction. And so we kind of have to go back and say, what kind of world do we want to live in? Because I might need to try and move things around a little bit to find a way to be engaged in this process a little bit more, which, again, I say this because I get hit all the time. Joe, you're in a privileged position. Da, 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 da. It's like, no, we all have to make value judgments in our life. We all do. Everybody's dealing with that in some way, shape, or form. And perhaps it's a little bit easier for others in their situation, but we're at a time where we're being asked to be engaged more than we have been, because not being engaged has led us here. But the last thing I'll say on that before we kind of switch gears, I'm sure, a little bit, is voting is not being engaged. What do I mean by that? To engage within the system that exists today, which continually leads us towards this authoritarian rule, simply going and casting a vote and then stepping back is not engagement. That is saying, well, I mean, based on the misleading information I was most likely provided from the media sources that are providing me information, I was led to make a decision of perhaps the lesser of two evils. And now my job is done. Our job is not done. The way we choose to be, the way we choose to live, the way we choose to engage, the way we choose to discuss with one another, what we choose to socially, contractually engage with, i.e. systems of voting that are leading us to a worse and worse world the further we go on. This is the stuff that we have to start questioning. What is really happening here? Because people will say, Joe, you don't vote, so you're not engaged. And I say, absolutely not. I spend my entire career being engaged in these discussions. And because of that, it has led me to say, this is not a system that I want to put my vote into, because I know where it is leading. And I think there's a deeper conversation that we need to have. So I engage every day in having that deeper conversation with people.
Okay, let's chat about that a little bit. What does your week look like? How much time do you or the other people that you work with, the other journalists, spend looking into this, looking into different topics? What's that process?
Yeah, and a simple answer: too much time. No, no. I would say that we've kind of gone through phases throughout the years. We tried to keep our work culture here, especially when we were properly funded, because we had built a very successful and thriving business before censorship, and we were able to have a lot of employees. We were able to stagger. We made sure people had Fridays pretty much to themselves. They could do whatever they wanted. And the work days were never overloaded. We specifically understood that the quality of information, the quality of person, the quality of being that goes into creating the content is going to be based on the quality of life that someone can have and the time that they have to sort of do the things they love, to be able to introspection. I know it sounds like a beautifully privileged life, but for me, it was about, if I can create that culture for our company, then I'm going to do that, even if it costs us more money to do it. So that's what we chose to do. And for that, people could work about 30 hours, 35 hours a week. and do what they need to do and get the information and make sure that there was time spent to take care of themselves as well. Now, once the censorship came along, it almost flipped it on its head. Now we were working like 50 hours a week to just try and keep up with what's happening. And it became a very unhealthy environment for those of us who were left to sort of work in. Now, we did what we could to stay well regulated, but honestly, nobody can work that much and stay at a really good physical, mental, even down to a nervous system level. Nobody can sit and do all that and expect to stay in a really good state. So I would say at this point, we're kind of trying to just do what it is that we can do that maintains quality. And so we probably work, 40 hours a week. You wake up, you go, I like mornings, I go, I do my thing. I do some research. Maybe I'm producing a video, shooting something, understanding what's going on. Again, we focus big picture. We're a small team right now. We can't cover every single thing that happens, nor is that our goal. Our goal is to more so pick key issues and have key discussions around those particular issues and see how it overlaps, see how we can drive deeper conversation. And that's kind of what we do. We sort of keep our finger on the pulse, so to speak, and find ways to engage where we feel it's going to make the biggest impact for what we're inspired by doing.
Okay, so someone might be watching this or listening to this, and they go, well, Joe, it wasn't necessarily censorship that started to lose the audience. It was this content that you're creating, and it's not trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know it was a strategy done by, I guess, big tech and the powers that be?
For sure. So there's nuance to the conversation for sure. Part of what Facebook did was related to making more money for their shareholders. Cutting organic reach to pages and brands was part of them making more money, right? So that's a piece of the puzzle. The side of it though, which they came out and said very clearly, was that we are also going to do something about fake news. And we are going to do something about information that we don't trust. Well, how do we know that was part of dismantling us? Well, there's been a number of whistleblowers. There's been a number of people who've come out over the past little while from inside Google, from inside YouTube, from inside Facebook that have said, look, here's the company policy on what we've been told to do, right? And most of that information is pretty damning. I mean, the discussion specifically around Google, and I think the guy's name is, last name is Voorhees. I think it's Matt is his first name. I'll have to double check, but I think he came out through Project Veritas initially. But he kind of showcased, look, here's Google's documents as to how they were basically going to wipe out people, especially people that were talking about natural health or different health or alternative health ideas, which our brand covered a lot. It's like, here's how they're going to wipe them out from the search algorithm. Well, that's exactly what they did, right? And we were part of that. We were pulled down in that. That's why we have the sort of, here's our search engine, boom, straight down. May 1st, 2020, straight down, right? It's that is 100% targeted removal. Our company, when you used to type in collective evolution on Google, it would come up collective evolution. You'd have this big title line, then you'd have like the explanation, then you'd have like the about section and these article or these key links, right? It was like that featured, this is a company, like really look at this. Now they removed it where you search it and it just says collective evolution and then a thing, and that's it. So they've even edited our listing so that it's less loud, it's less in your face, right? And how do I know that they've done that? Well, if you search in a lot of other alternative media companies like the Daily Wire, for example, they'll come out with the big listing that we used to have back in the day. So there's a lot of this sort of targeting that was very clear going on. Now, the question that gets asked is our content bad, right? And were they trying to shut it out? Well, this is the $1 million question that everyone has a very, very difficult time answering. Is it at the highest level of decision making? Is it like, look, you need to cast doubt on this kind of stuff and it just needs to happen. And they know that it's not false information, but they're pushing that agenda anyway because they're losing control. Can you prove that 100%? No, you cannot. You cannot prove 100% that these powerful interests are telling people you need to shut this out. But it's pretty obvious, right? It's pretty obvious. You can see the conflicts of interests. You can see the connections. You can see the lack of explanation. Like, why is Dr. Robert Malone completely scrubbed from Wikipedia, right? Come on. Like, it starts to get like if we're not asking these questions, we might be missing what's going on here. Now, going back to it, did we make mistakes or put out false information or whatever? It's like, aside from perhaps, I mean, in alternative media, we always sourced everything. We relied heavily on peer-reviewed scientific journals, just as everybody else does. We always made it very clear where all of our information came from. We backed everything up with facts. Inevitably, any news organization will make a small error. Maybe you worded that sentence, maybe it could have been a little clearer. Maybe you made, you misrepresented a name or something like that. But what started to happen was that fact checkers would come after us ever since around 2018 or so. It picked up really heavily. And they would create arguments about our content claiming, oh, you said this, and we're going to debunk that. But we never actually said that. We said something different, and they can't debunk that because there is no debunking it. And so instead they create an argument that sounds similar to our argument, and then they debunk that. Well, you got to ask the question, why is somebody doing that? Like, what's going on there? Either these people have been told to do that, or they themselves are caught up in a culture that says, I believe this information is dangerous. Well, where did they learn that culture? Likely from the institutions, mainstream media, the government, so on and so forth, that they've been told to trust, and that then, in a sense, they've been manipulated to trust. So are all these people evil and bad and la-di-da-di-da that are working at these big tech companies? Absolutely not. I would say the vast majority of them, if not like 98% of them, are just regular people like you and me. But they're part of a culture that tells them and reinforces the idea, look, that's the enemy. Look what they're doing. Look what's happening. Look what's taking place. And if you're not really careful in looking at what you look at, you can start to believe that very deeply, right? It's very easy to believe that. And I think we're going to look back at this particular time of mass censorship, and we're going to say, man, there's some similarities here as to why so many people went along with something that was so rabidly false and that was so rabidly dangerous. And it's going to remind us of other points in history where people did very similar things. And I think people are going to hear me say that and go, no way. And 5-10 years from now, we'll see.
I agree. Let's dig into this fact checkers topic, because I'll post things and people will put fact checker articles as like, see, Nicole, you're wrong. And some of these articles don't even have authors. They don't even have bylines. And they'll say, we talked to a scientist.
Yeah.
What? I don't even get to see the name of that scientist?
Yeah.
So let's go through, how many of your articles have been fact checked legitimately versus you had to fight them, and we obviously know with the Wuhan lab leak, you had an article out 10 months ago talking about that.
Yeah. So when that article came out 10 months ago, it was, 2 or 3 days before we received the fact check. We, of course, the way we presented the article very simply was the conclusion here from the information gathered and the information available and the science available is that we don't know whether or not this was created in a lab or potentially leaked from a lab, whether intentional or unintentional, doesn't matter, or whether or not it came from a wet market. That's literally what the science says, and we should be open to both ideas. Fact checkers came in, and they used somebody else's article in rash claims to sort of debunk ours, saying, this is what you guys are saying. It's been long held. All scientists across the world basically agree that this was created in a wet market, and that's what's going on, and shut up. So of course, we then engage with the fact checkers in a conversation. I literally, from a journalistic point of view, you're wrong. Like, from a journalistic point of view, they are objectively wrong, right? There is not a scientific consensus. There is a small, tiny group of scientists who we later found out had conflict of interest, where basically Tony Fauci essentially guided them on how to write the paper. Fauci would be held liable in some way, shape, or form if this did in fact leak from a lab. The other guy, Peter Danzig, was also, or I think it was Dasig, Dasek, sorry. I'm confused the name because it's a bit of a different one, but he was also would have been liable for how that information would have come out. And he was one of the lead authors on the initial letter that sort of became the piece that, moved everybody towards this, oh, well, it wasn't really created in a lab. So the whole story was rife with conflict of interest. And a number of journalists that did the work kind of had a sense that that's what was going on. They couldn't prove it. They had a sense. And yet we were all, no, object, you're wrong, right? So what happens in that case? And this is very similar to many other cases we've been through. You're literally held hostage by these fact checkers. What they do is they tell you you're wrong and that's it. And there's no discussion. You bring up some discussion. They literally like almost ignore you and just say, until you change the article, we're not lifting the fake news strike. And people will go, well, that's not that big of a deal. So one of your thousands of pieces of content has a little fake news thing that follows it around on Facebook. That's not a big deal. It's a massive deal. So the reason why it's a massive deal is when that happens, your page, so when you go on Facebook and you post something, it reaches a certain amount of people. When you have a fact check, that reach is diminished incredibly. So what it means is you can post all day long and nobody's going to see what you're trying to put out there, because until that fact check is removed, your page reach is limited. Well, page reach equals our ability to reach our audience, connect with our audience, collect emails from our audience, get those people to follow other social media channels that we're part of. We can't market our membership as organically. And then of course our advertising dollars diminish because we're not driving people to our website. So by utilizing a fact check, they're able to cut the funding legs out of a company in a roundabout way that nobody would say, well, hold on a second, this ad platform deplatformed you, that's wrong. So instead they skip that step and they go to your ability to drive traffic. And where do people get traffic from? Social media, YouTube, this, that, whatever. So when you get either censored or demonetized on those platforms, it's like chopping the legs out of a business, right? So that's why that's so impactful, is it's their key to making you go away. Because once you don't have the funding, you don't have the time to spend in creating the content. And all of a sudden your ability to reach people slowly just goes away.
What makes an independent media company like yourself, because you were getting sponsorship advertisement, so what makes you different than a mainstream media company who's using sponsorship and advertisement as well?
Yeah, for sure. So we, for a long time, I think it was for about 10 years or so, we used the same platform that virtually all of mainstream media uses, called Google AdSense. So Google AdSense, we would put these little banners essentially on our website. Ads would be served as people either came to the website or clicked the ads, and we would make money. It's the exact same stuff that's happening in mainstream media. That's how most people online were making money, especially back in 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's what was going on there. Were we taking money from companies to produce content that would, promote their company and almost like as a native editorial? I think we maybe did that about 8 times, whereas mainstream media probably does that like 8 times a day. We were doing that significantly less. So ours was more so focused on just running the ads. Now, one thing that people don't realize is that AdSense right off the hop gives priority payment and priority almost bidding to these mainstream media outlets. So they're always going to make more money for serving the exact same ads than we will. So that's unfair advantage number 1. Unfair advantage number 2 is, I think it was at the beginning, I did a whole video on this. Again, I released all of the data. And I think I even broke a Google code because I'm not supposed to show people our AdSense backend, but I did anyway, because at this point we were about to sever our relationship with them. But what they started to do to us is, typically when someone comes to the website, over the course of a month, millions of people come to the website. A small percentage of the clicks that happened on an ad where you make money are considered invalid, usually between 1% and 3% of the amount of clicks, because it's a bot or somebody accidentally clicked or whatever happened. So why should the business have to pay for an ad that was accidentally clicked? I agree with that. So they remove a small portion of our ad revenue at the end of the month. Okay, guys, you made, let's say, $10,000, but 1% of that was invalid, so we're going to take off $100. You're like, no problem. So for 10 years, it was always $100 here, $200 there, whatever, $100, no big deal, no big deal. all of a sudden like I say, I forget the exact date on this, but I believe it was in late 2019. It might have been like December of 2019. They started to remove, at first they removed 30% of our revenue. So they said, oh, 30% of your revenue is invalid, right? And it was really difficult. It took us months to figure out this was even happening, because you'd get a statement at the end. It would say, hey, you made $10,000 this month, right? And you're like, okay, great. You mark it down in your thing, whatever, and you wait for the money to show up in your bank account, because it takes 23 days. So you're sitting there and you're waiting, going about your day. You're moving on to your next, like, you're busy, you're doing your work, you're doing everything it has to do. You don't realize that what they've actually done is they've taken that $10,000, they've cut 30% off of it. They didn't tell you, they didn't email you, they didn't notify you, but all of a sudden only $7,000 shows up in your bank account. You don't realize, because if you're not checking all the time and you're not having accounting cross-reference what it's supposed to say, you just don't know what's happening. So then the next month it was 40%. The next month it was 50%. The next month it was 55%. Then it was 60%. By the time we figured out what was going on, they were removing 70% of our revenue, claiming it's invalid traffic. And we're going, wait a minute, for 10 years, it's been predictable. We know what's happening. We know what's going on. It's been the same thing for 10 years. Why all of a sudden? What's going on here? You can't contact anybody. You can't get any information. Everybody online that is writing about this, talking about this, agrees that, yeah, it's 1% to 5% all the time. It's never beyond that. So we're all of a sudden experiencing 40, 50%. So I said, I'm going to keep an experiment going. I'm going to see how high they go. They stopped at around 82% for the next couple of months. They basically bumped it up to around 80%, and the following month was about 82%. So we finally said, so we're making money. They're just removing it and telling us it's invalid. All of the numbers line up in the sense that what we should have made is what we would have expected to make for the traffic we were driving. But they were saying, no, by not telling anybody. So we eventually had to sever our relationship with them. But that was, again, a very silent, quiet way of pushing out publishers that they didn't want associated with the platform. It's a form of shadow banning that happens, again, at the level of your funding.
So when people have ideas like, oh, these independent companies aren't making it just because the content isn't as good, there's actual evidence that it's intentional.
100%. I'm not going to say 100% as an objective journalist and say, yes, 100% it's there. I would say it would be very difficult to make the argument that this is not part of what's going on. And I think that in this day and age, again, if you take a step back and you look at what's happening, if you cross a certain line during COVID, and that line is casting being a scientist and saying, look, I have evidence here that a lot of other scientists agree with that says we might want to consider stopping the vaccination program right now. Not vaccines altogether, just these spike protein vaccines might be a mistake. Look at all the evidence. Look at the people who are getting sick. Look at the people who are dying. Look at the people who are getting injured. Let's at least stop it for kids. That's crossing a line. And now you're going to be deplatformed, demonetized, censored, removed from everywhere. No explanation as to why. It just happens. And most people don't know that this is happening because mainstream media is not going to say, well, today Dr. Robert Malone was removed from Wikipedia so that people couldn't find him. We're not going to report on that because the mainstream media, unfortunately, has become more so a mouthpiece for establishment than it has been actually holding them accountable and doing what journalism is really about, which is saying, look, if authority is going to exist and it's supposed to represent people, we need an objective third party to kind of make sure that that's actually happening, and we need to notify the people. That story has long been erased. Like decades and decades and decades, that story has been erased. So, of course, people are going to understand that this is happening because they're not hearing about it. And then, of course, they're going to be able to say, well, it's probably not what that, it's probably that it's fake news, because guess what? There is fake news out there. There are websites, and I've spoken to many admins out there who ran websites or stuff on Facebook, and I would tell them, I said, look, you're going to get us all in trouble because you're one person who's just copying, pasting content from all over the internet, putting it on your website, and then just disseminating it. You're not quality checking. You're not making sure it's true. You're not making sure it's this. So is there a problem out there with fake news? Absolutely. Is it anywhere near as widespread as the mainstream likes to think it is? Not even close. But it does affect what people believe. The problem is that in that fake news story, and the choice to censor, the choice to shut down that free speech. So instead of leaving it on the average person to decide, well, maybe I should take responsibility and decide what's true and not true. Instead of leaving it at that, they said, no, we're going to come in and control everything. And what a great opportunity, this is my theory, to pull down anybody with us that has been threatening our idea. And for people who think, well, why would they do that? Why would they care to do that? Why do billionaires buy media organizations? Why do they do it? Well, because now they can perception control, right? You have Vanguard as a company and BlackRock as a company. Just take some time, do some research, look at who they own. They own the vast majority of all news media in the United States, and they own the vast majority, I think 1,600 of major companies in the United States. So there is a direct conflict of interest there with that ownership structure that says we're able to, make sure that stories go that protect our interests in media, right? Of course, like if you were a billionaire and you had tons of money and you had a company that sold a certain widget and there was another competitor selling widgets and you owned the media company that everybody watched, would you potentially run a story that only talked about the problems with the other person's widget and not yours? I mean, you'd make a lot more money, right? So I think this is what's happening.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's also other conflicts of interest too, where there's board members. Like, is it something like with the media companies, there's a board member at the media company and also connected to a pharmaceutical company?
That might be. I wouldn't know the specifics of that, but I know that what often does happen is you'll have, for example, a pharmaceutical company will have a president or a vice president who will go and become part of like the FDA or the CDC, work there for 4 years, and then go back to the company. So essentially, you have this revolving door relationship between massive pharmaceutical companies and the regulation. So they essentially go and they develop the relationships. They do what they need to do. They get done what they need to get done for the company, and then they come back to the company, are paid heavily. Julie Gerberding is a very good example of that. She's part of Merck, and I think she worked with the CDC, or I believe it was the CDC, and she was paid heavily for what she helped do when she left Merck and went to, when she was in the CDC and then came back to Merck. So it's there.
So this is like common beliefs that are going around with people who are questioning things, that you are anti-science, that you're a psychopath, and that like you're not considerate of people. What's the third one? What are your thoughts around being anti-science? Let's start there.
Yeah, so anti-science, I mean, first off, the question of what is science, right? What's the purpose of science? Because I have had a movie idea that I've wanted to make for about 6 years. And every year that goes by where I don't make the movie, the thesis of the film gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And the film is called Unscientific. And the purpose of the film is to say, and again, because we've been in this space for so long, what you're hearing major scientists say today, we've been saying for 6 or 7 or 8 years, which is that the science that decides policy is completely unscientific. And the nature of science as in essence, almost like a religion now, has become unscientific, right? You have these pleas coming from doctors and scientists right now during COVID saying, this is not science. Science is about having dialogue. It's about understanding. It's about, we don't know yet. We know a little bit, but we don't know yet. So you got to stop making these assertive statements about something when we don't know what's going on entirely. And then you can't shut out people who come forth saying, look, I'm submitting this for critique so that us as a community can discuss this. And instead they're saying, nope, you're not allowed to have this critique. You shut away, go away. But you didn't address my arguments. Doesn't matter, we don't need to. That's not science, right? So what's happening at a mainstream level, objectively, is anti-science. And now I'm not saying that to just push back the same rhetoric that's being pushed onto us, onto other people. That's not why I'm saying it. I'm saying it because it's objectively what it is. And that's why objective minds that have been heavily trained, that have won Nobel Peace Prizes for science, are coming out saying, guys, waving a flag here. What's happening is not science, it's anti-science. This is a problem. So what I say to people is, I ask them the question, where do you get the perspective from that what we might be doing or somebody else might be doing is anti-science? And I don't know what that person might say all the time, but there's going to be different ideas. Well, I heard that, this, and this, you're casting doubt on vaccines, or you think masks don't work, or you think this. And I say, okay, well, what makes you think that these things are what they are? Where did you get the information from? And then I don't say, well, oh, you got your information from mainstream media, therefore you're dumb. No, I say, okay, so that's where you garnered your perspective. Great. Do you realize that there are other perspectives out there that are backed by information, that are backed by science? And if so, would you be willing to have a look at it? The vast majority of the time, people say, yeah, absolutely. Even if they have an initial objection that says something like, yeah, well, that's probably not trustworthy. And I'd say, what would be trustworthy? I'm curious. We're just having a conversation. And they might say, well, it would have to be in a journal. It'd have to be peer reviewed, or it'd have to be this. And I say, okay, great. All of that stuff is there. So let's have a quick look. Most of the time, people will end up going, yeah, there's actually a lot more unanswered question here than I realized. Right? I think that's the position I'm in. I don't know all the answers. We're just this stuff is unclear, but there's a culture that's saying it's super clear. We know exactly what's happening. And if you don't agree with this, you are dangerous. Which is really like saying, we know that if people knew what we were really doing, they would say that it's dangerous. So we need to call people that would figure out we're dangerous. We need to call them dangerous so that everybody just points to them as being dangerous instead of us. I would argue that that projection is what's happening to a certain extent within the culture of what's happening in government and perhaps mainstream media to some extent. So the psychopathic tendency, again, I would go back to that again. Explain yourself. What do you mean by that, right? Because if somebody wanted to say, well, alternative media, we could look at Alex Jones. Well, somebody might say, well, yeah, he exhibits characteristics. I'm not saying he's a psychopath, but he exhibits characteristics that the average person might feel uncomfortable by. And if they're uncomfortable, that might not be that far of a leap to say this guy's crazy, he's a psychopath. Whereas if you listen to a lot of well-grounded individuals that are having these conversations, you're going to figure out very quickly, these people are of a stable mind, they're loving, they're trying to help the world. That is so clearly their mission. And they're just trying to offer information that all of them are dumbfounded. They can't understand why this is not being addressed at a mainstream level. And that's what you would find if you took a step and just actually looked at what's going on. The challenges, everybody's keyboard warriors today. We're disconnected, right? We listen to mainstream media. Mainstream media told us that anybody online who doubts anything is bad. You need to attack them. And so they do, right? And is it their fault? Well, again, when people are being told something over and over and over again, and they don't take the time, we don't want to be out of the in crowd as people. This is why we focus a lot on baseline physiology of humans, right? Our biology, our physiology thrives in community. It thrives in co-regulation, being able to connect with people. You listen to people who have been in the alternative for a long time, it can be a lonely space. It can be a space where you don't get to connect with people as easily. If you had to choose, would you rather connect with people or never connect with people? Most people are going to say, I'd rather connect with people. So it's a lot to ask somebody to say, do you want to have a look at these ideas that might result in you having friction with your friends? It's a lot to ask somebody.
And I've experienced that for sure. I'm sure you have as well.
Sure.
Maybe just a little bit sooner in your, maybe because you started this media company a while ago, but the last thing I remembered what people have been saying, that those who are questioning what's going on and the things being implemented by government can't emotionally handle what's going on. So they come up with other ideas.
Yeah. When we look at what's going on objectively by the numbers, it's obviously like, yeah, there's some people dying, right? There's no denying that. How many people are dying is a little bit of a difficult discussion. Why they're dying is interesting. If you look at public policy is written where there is vagueness around whether somebody died of COVID or not. Now, how many numbers of people would you say, well, they didn't die of COVID? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, some states have had counties that took different metrics for what would be considered a COVID death. reran their numbers in their public health centers, and they said, you know what? We reduced our COVID death rate by about 25 to 30%. Those people didn't actually die of COVID. Well, 25, 30% is a big number, right? And it's interesting. So it's interesting. A small tweak in what you consider a COVID death suddenly reduces numbers by a lot. Now, again, I'm not saying that suddenly it's not killing anybody and we're not dealing with something, but I've been objectively looking at this since this began. When this first started, I specifically told our team, I said, guys, this is a complicated issue, right? Immediately, I was talking to different people who had different connections, some people in the intelligence community in the United States, and they said, look, I don't even know if I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to say it because I'm not going to reveal any names. I knew right away that the intelligence community had already told people this came from a lab and that there's other strains that are more dangerous, that have higher death rates. So I thought to myself, okay, I don't know what's going on. I'm not going to go to my audience and represent that I know what's going on. This needs to play out. I don't want to create a lot of fear, and I don't want to create so much doubt that people don't take this seriously. We don't know what's going on. Let's give it time. So we kind of loosely covered some stuff for a couple of months, let things sort of figure out. And then after about 4-8 weeks, that sort of stuff, it was like, okay, things are starting to become clearer. Let's start talking a little bit. And we did, right? And the more time went on, the more we realized there's a massive portion of the scientific community that is saying very clearly, the crisis that we're in is nowhere near as bad as we're making it out to be, because it objectively is not. It's not that crazy when you look at the actual numbers. Yeah, when you're listening to mainstream media, it's going to make you feel like, yeah, you can't handle this crisis, right? But it's an interesting judgment for someone to say, well, and it's an okay thought. I mean, I welcome the thought, right? That, oh, you might not be able to handle this and therefore you're making up stories. But it's like, well, what happens? That might be true for some people. What about the people who are making up stories? They're just looking at the data. They're just looking at the evidence. They're just looking at what's there. And they're saying, guys, there's a discussion to be had here. Are they just afraid to handle, or they couldn't handle what's going on? I might be able to say, and I started writing an essay about this, there is reams, so much data out there. Psychologists who have written papers upon papers upon papers. Why do people believe conspiracy theories? Now, I've been studying trauma for about a year pretty aggressively, like tons and tons of courses. I'm currently finishing up a course that would give me the title of being a trauma specialist. Now, I don't intend on using this for clinical purposes, but for me, I wanted to understand it because I feel like it says a lot about our society. It helps me to understand what's going on. And ultimately, what we've been creating all these years is trauma-informed media. And now I want ways of being able to describe that better to our audience. And what you find is that all the arguments that are being made for why people believe in conspiracy theories could equally, just as easily be flipped and said, why don't people believe in conspiracy theories? You literally could flip it on its head and all of the psychology would remain the same. People are unable to accept the fact that this conspiracy is real because it would mean that they can't trust what they've put trust in, their government, right? So they're going to avoid that information no matter how much evidence exists because they can't handle that shift in their worldview. And it's true. That is a very stressful thing to go through. You might say the opposite. Well, 9/11 was such a stressful thing. And I don't know if I can deal with the fact that there's these terrorists out there trying to kill me. So I got to make up a story that it was my government. Well, okay, that's possible as well. But where does the evidence point? The evidence points that pretty objectively, if you look at it, the story we were told about 9/11 is obviously not true. We don't know what the truth is, but that story has been scientifically broken apart for years by well-credentialed individuals. And we know that that story is not true. So what is true? What did happen? And it doesn't mean that we know exactly what did or who was responsible, but people ask questions because intelligent, smart people look at it and say, well, there's something going on here. And the same thing's happening with COVID. The same thing's happened with other things. So yeah, the psychology part of this is very important, but there's a false assumption being made that all people who believe in conspiracy, whatever that might be, are somehow mentally ill. And the reality of the situation is you could make that exact same argument or people who are unwilling to look at the obvious.
Whoa, Joe, that's so resonates with me. And where I think the most uncomfortable spot to be is where it seems like you're living and I'm living and we're trying to live is in that, okay, we don't know. It's not black and white.
Yes.
And when we try to make, I think on either side, when we try to make things certain, that might be a signifier of maybe the trauma you're speaking of. It's like you want to feel safe, so you need to believe in something with certainty.
Yeah. Yeah, you look at the physiology of what happens biologically, physiologically in the body when we might be uncertain about something that affects our shelter, our food, our social relationships, whatever it might be, the nature of whether I'm going to be alive or not. And that's usually perceptual, right? Sometimes we might see a threat. Like I went through this myself. I saw threats all the time in my socioeconomic stability when the censorship was happening. So I would go home and my body would still be in a stress response going, I don't know how I'm going to pay the bills because, big tech just took away all of our revenue. And I'm not sure what we're going to do or this, how, whatever. And I'd be stuck in the stress response. Right. And I had to face that. I had to do a lot of work to come back to having a regulated physiology. Well, the same thing when you're being told in the media, well, this virus is going to kill everybody. Look at this. This is so dangerous. It is so dangerous. It is going to maim. Well, you're in a constant threat response. What happens when you're in a threat response? Well, primalistically, like if you were to just look at a point where, humans have this threat response, it seems to be based in some regard off of animals as well. So there's a bit of an overlap there. But you start to see that tiger comes or some threat comes, human goes, oh my gosh, runs away, right? So you get a concoction of different chemicals running through your body that's based on the threat response. You run away. And then once you get there, you stop, you're in your cave, your body starts to metabolize all of those chemicals, your nervous system goes back down to normal, and you're regulated again. That's how a threat response is supposed to happen. But what happens in regular life when that threat isn't a tiger, i.e., I can't get up, run from my bills, and then have my body metabolize those chemicals. No, instead, I get up, I go, my bills, it's following me around 24/7. That threat is there 24/7, right? So now my body's not metabolizing, but I'm exhausting myself. Someone turns on COVID. COVID, it's so dangerous. It's so scary. Everyone's masked up, all this stuff, and the threat response is there. And you might not even realize that you're stuck in this sort of physiology that's tensed up. There's a lot of tension there. Like most people can audit this themselves. Check your shoulders, check your jaw, check your fists, check your lower pelvis area, check, some of these areas in your body. Are you holding tension? Because you're not really supposed to be, right? That's stored up stress, which is in essence trauma. And when it happens over a long period of time, that cumulative trauma starts to change the way our physiology functions, which changes the way our mind functions, changes the way we perceive our world. And sometimes our executive thinking, which is the part of our brain that really focuses on things like connection and empathy and social awareness and being able to think, our higher thinking, our higher reasoning, that is severely inhibited the more we are in a stress response. So now let's think of the connection. Are we able to understand the true nature of what's going on and connect and empathize with people when we are constantly in a stress response? Now let's think of how media and government handles the vast majority of what goes on. Constant fear. So whether it's intentional or not, people are being put into a cumulative stress-related stress response that shuts down their ability to effectively reason and connect with people. I'm not saying they're doing it on purpose. I'm saying it's the nature of our culture. It's the nature of not having a deeper understanding of being in our body, of knowing what's going on. And again, I'm not trying to oversimplify it to the point where, well, just because you have a little bit of tension, it means you can't think. No, I'm saying there's varying degrees of this. And some of us, we might not fully understand the nature of what's happening and how much it's affecting us and how much, we've gotten used to a state of being where we're pretty numbed out, from being connected with people and empathizing. We've gotten used to that. And that's not really our natural state.
What does healthy media look like to you? And what does it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question, probably an evolving question. For me, I've always tried to say, look, like it or not, we're in a moment in time in history, and you could argue we've always kind of had these times, but I think it's pretty intense right now, where there are some things about our world that are not that easy to look at, right? And so the question becomes, is it necessary to look at them to understand that a change needs to happen? I would argue that in a lot of cases, yes, there are certain things we need to look at, specifically things that are the cornerstone of how our society operates, like perhaps government, perhaps the way our economic systems do produce by design a great deal of suffering, a great deal of limitation, a great deal of blocking of innovation, blocking of being able to solve problems very quickly and easily. We've accepted systems that are incredibly limiting, right? But we got to be able to look at them. We got to be able to understand how they function. We got to understand that there's a possibility, most likely, that the people that are in charge of these systems don't really have a vested interest in wanting to see them change. And if they do want to change, it might look similar to like what we're seeing with the Great Reset, whereby the powerful interests that own and control a lot of the world would want to be the decision makers as to what the new world would look like. So these are things that I'd argue we sort of have to look at because they're part of answering the deeper question. Why is the world the way it is? Why do things happen the way that they do? When we go to the voting booth, are we really making change, or do we think we're making change, but then it doesn't really change and things get worse? Is solving it at the voting booth the answer? You know, what's going on there? How do I feel within myself? How do I connect with other people? How am I, am I seeing that there's huge rifts in society? There's huge divides in society. What type of world do I want to live in? What do I want it to look like? To be able to ask all these questions, we got to be able to get ourselves into a state where we feel better. Number one, we have a better sense of being in our body. So now we're getting down just to the foundation of how we operate, right? So we spend a lot of time focusing on some of this personal transformation stuff, some of slowing life down a little bit, taking a breath, releasing some tension in the body, just letting ourselves kind of go back. Like in our members area, we focus a little bit more on some of this stuff, but just really taking the time to realize like we're living our lives in a way that if we're not paying attention, if we're not coming back to this, it's disadvantageous to our health, to our ability to connect as a society. So let's look at that as part of the puzzle. We need to be feeling better. We need to get back to good regulated nervous systems. The other piece of the puzzle is looking at some of these things that are a little bit scary or that are hard to face and asking, how did they get there? A little bit, only to the point that we need to go. We don't need to understand every detail of everything. We just need to know enough that says, all right, you know what, we're making the right choice. We got to make a change here, right? We need to be able to agree on ideas so that we can make changes. And sometimes that's part of it. Like we have no problem talking about the fact that child sex trafficking happens across the US and Mexican border, and then saying, yeah, we got to do something about that. But the moment you suggest that there's evidence that child sex trafficking might be happening, and some politicians are fully aware of it, and they're letting it go on, well, no, you can't talk about that. Because what happens there? That now undermines the key structure of society. How could that have possibly happened, right? That's an ugly thing. So sex trafficking, okay to look at, but not if it involves even just a few people who are a part of some of the key systems of our world. So we have to be able to look at that. We have to understand, is leadership really leading us in a good direction, right? Why might it not be? What do they go through, right? There's a lot of questions there. So healthy media would be, how can we look at these things? So how can we bring in that personal transformation bit, right? Helping people feel good, reminding them to just take some of these simple steps, but then also look at these sometimes difficult, not everything we talk about is like, oh, this is so difficult, but some of these difficult things and say, how can we look at this in a healthy way? So you're not trying to polarize people. You're not trying to scare people. You're choosing your language. You're facing it head on. You're providing solutions. You're providing questions. And you're creating an environment where people can look at that. And when we've done our surveys, something like 70% of people have said, you cover these hard to look at subjects better than both mainstream and alternative media, right? So they agree that we do it better than everybody else. I shouldn't say everybody else, but than a lot of other people, which means these viewers have said on their own that we're covering these subjects in a way that isn't making them feel like crap. That's a big deal, in my opinion. And I think that's part of our story right now, is being able to look at things, because a lot of people want to run from it. Oh, I don't want to look at that stuff. Well, yeah, because we don't have the capacity to look at it. We're already worn out. So how do we build up our capacity, plus look at this stuff and have the resilience to be able to bounce back from whatever it might mean and whatever it might say, so that we can take action, because that's where we're at. We got to be able to do that.
Yeah, I love that. And for the last probably year and a half, 2 years, I've also integrated with my media students doing self-development majorly. Every 4 months we do a big workshop where we're looking at our values, where we're looking at how we regulate ourselves, our envisioned futures, how to be more positive. Because I know if someone's in alignment, the product will be good.
Yep.
If someone's in alignment and they're centered and in their body, as you talk about, they're going to do a better job of communicating in a way that inspires that in others, even when it's a hard topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it goes back to it, right? We're human, we're beings that thrive off of co-regulation, right? We thrive off of looking at each other. I mean, our physiology is made up of it. We have mirror neurons that I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, and there are processes happening behind the scenes in my brain that is looking at all of your facial expressions, everything you're doing. And it is telling my body how you're feeling a little bit. Maybe not entirely, but it's telling a lot of things. And the way we see each other, the way we see facial reactions, the way everything's there, this is us co-regulating together. This is us helping our bodies. This is built into our physiology. So of course, if a presenter or if a person who's producing something is producing it at a level where they're well regulated, they feel good, and they're able to express that, other people pick up on that and go, I don't know what it is, but there's something there that's making me feel okay, that's making me feel good. Now think of that on the flip side, where you have the mainstream perspective, not in all mainstream, but in a lot of cases where they're either some of the characters like Rachel Maddow or, whatever, where they're like super like crazy and like furrowed eyebrows and blah, 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 doing that kind of stuff. What does that do to a viewer? And then on the flip side, you might have the robot teleprompter, blah, 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 blah. There's no warmness there, right? And that warmness is incredibly important in making a connection. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be there. I'm arguing the idea that it might be better that it is there. We'll find out, and that, I think this is kind of part of the sort of the discussion around it is, why are we negating our natural physiology, our natural, essence of us as humans? And you could take the discussion even deeper and start studying some of what, quantum science and post-material science says about things that are more unseen, right? Like the electromagnetic field, our hearts, the measurable electromagnetic field our hearts give off, right? How does that impact the way we interact with people? That can be felt. I mean, these studies have been done. Maybe people don't know about it, but these studies have been done, and they say a lot about the unseen factors that happen and how much more important that becomes as well. So there's a lot there. I mean, we can go on all day about this, but sometimes it does get a bit deep.
No, but as you said, when you bring in those stories, it's actually really inspiring, and and I agree they're not being covered. But then we have the flip side. Going back, we have the Alex Jones, who is like super intense as well. It's like it's hard to watch Alex Jones or something like that. So no matter what side you fall on, there's that intensity. Yeah. And can we leave space for people to also be themselves? That's where I'm at. It's like, can we just leave space where we don't need to be perfect? I mean, I'm already beating myself up about certain elements of this interview. I'm like, did I fumble? It's funny how we start to attack ourselves. But can we just let people be human as well? That's where I'm at.
Absolutely. That, and I think that's one of the keys to all this is instead of judging why someone is doing that, right, and saying, well, they're doing this, they're bad, they're this, it's more so asking the question, well, what might be behind why that's happening? And is there a reason to evolve it? Is maybe there's not. And you can't ask them, hey, go change, evolve. You'd lead by example, right? You say, well, look, this is why I say, like, we're doing independent alternative media or whatever, but we often say, we talk about alternative media sometimes as if we might not be in that realm. And all we mean by that is like, Well, because we're also carving out a bit of a niche for ourselves that says maybe there's a different way to do this. And here it is. This is what we're trying to do. Let me know how it feels. And I think the more that happens, I think the more people can look at that and go, do I want to do that, or do I want to keep doing what I'm doing, or and that's, I think that's where we allow for sort of the natural evolution of these ideas. But we got to converse about them, we got to bring them up, and we got to see how we feel about them.
Amazing. Okay, where can people find you and engage with you and your company?
For sure. So we now have, like I said, two brands, Collective Evolution and The Pulse. Collective Evolution is a little bit more now geared towards the personal transformation side of things. So we're going to be focusing on big picture solutions, transformation on that side. And then on the Pulse side of things, which is our new brand that's focused on journalism, it's where we're going to take all of our CE values with us, which is to say we're going to produce this sort of conscious media that's trauma informed, if you will. And we're going to dive into a lot of the journalism, a lot of what's going on with a forward-thinking, sort of progressive, solution-oriented idea associated with it. And we're going to be asking, we're always asking the deeper questions. What are the belief systems, the paradigms, the worldviews that are driving the way society is? Like, how can we answer that question of how do we create a more thriving society? So that's kind of what's going on there. So both of them have a website. One is collective-evolution.com. The other one is thepulse.one. And that's .one. They also have social media channels on everything, which you'll be able to find from both websites.
Awesome, and we'll link everything in. Do you feel like I missed anything that you really want to touch on?
No, I mean, I think it was a great discussion. There's so much here, and because so much of this is complex, there's probably a million questions that people are going to have. Yeah, but what about this? But what about that? Because we are also trained to be so definitively certain, well, this was said this way, therefore I know what he said. But it's like, well, no, this is what dialogue is for, right? We gain clarity from one another. So inevitably, I'm sure there's going to be questions, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I want to touch on that a little bit more, because I had people coming at my posts a little bit because I would post just a speech of someone.
Yeah.
And they're like, you need to tell me where this person's from, what they're about, and I'm trying to get people, like you're saying, to just connect, just listen to someone's story and see how it makes you feel inside. Yeah. No matter if you've decided if this person's a write-off or not a write-off, or associated with this side or that side, just listen to this person's story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it also too suggests okay, so you look into somebody's background, whoever it might be, and you find out that 20 years ago they did X, whatever it is. Well, are you suggesting that people can't change? Are we really going to sit here and believe that, because somebody might have did something when they were 16 years old, they can never do anything good ever again? Is that the vision we want for humanity, right? Who is somebody right now in this moment? And yes, let's think critically and ask some of the deeper questions, but be open to the fact that we're always evolving beings. And that's an important part of this whole discussion as well.
Okay, I have one last question. Your envisioned future. You can wave a magic wand.
Yeah.
What are you doing in 5 years? And what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, in 5 years, it's interesting because I'm toying between you go kind of the realistic route, if you will, whatever that means, or you kind of just go the magic wand route.
You're going the magic wand route. That's
magic wand. Okay, yeah. So yeah, magic wand would be, in 5 years, humanity has come to an understanding that, a lot of things that have been happening in our world, that was the story we lived before. And we kind of looked at it and said, you know what, we can thrive on this planet and we can create something that's incredible. And what does that look like? Well, each of us can have somewhat of a say in that. As I get emotional talking about this stuff all the time, but it's it's a vision of a world where we don't, yes, there's going to be challenges. That's okay. But there can be, an ability to thrive that isn't based on having to be fighting with each other and disconnected and having all these challenges all the time in the story that we've come to believe about how the world needs to function and how it needs to be and how we all have to just confine ourselves to our separate little corners of the world, and we can come together in particular ways. Maybe we have different areas of the planet that experiment with different ways of living and different ways of being, and instead of looking at each other and saying your way's bad, my way's good, and this way, whatever, it's like, ooh, that's a cool experiment over there. Maybe I want to go experience that for a few years, and then I'll come back over here. And we're all just kind of in this as hey, we've made up all these rules as to what it can't be, and it has to be like this. We made them up. We socially, contractually negotiate the world that we live in, and we agree to it. What's to say we can't agree to something else? And so I see a world where, yeah, things aren't driven so much by money, where we're not purposefully halting innovation and problem solving because it has to fit within an economy. But I also don't, like, I'm not trying to say I believe in a world where, the billionaires, take ownership control of everything and everybody has to rent it from the billionaires. I'm not saying the Great Reset either. I'm saying humanity is capable of something different, but we have to be able to imagine and embody it. And the more we imagine and embody something, and act, when I say embody, that's what takes it from, well, it's just a dream in my head, and actually puts it into how I choose to live my life, how I converse with other people about it. Whatever we choose to sort of have the world be the way it is, we make it that way. If we want to hate somebody, we hate them. If we want to, make it so that this person can't come in our house, we make it so that they can't come in our house. We're choosing these things. So if we want to make it where we can have a world where we thrive, yeah, it's a bigger dream. It's a bigger, more complicated thing. But if you choose it and you embody it, then that's the conversations we have. That's the direction we move towards. We stop making other choices and other conversations that just reinforce the old. We recognize the old is playing and it's happening and it's here, but we're not saying that it has to be this way. That's kind of the vision is I don't know what it's going to look like because it's not up to me. It's up to everybody.
I like that. And just, can we thrive? Can we tap into more of our potential? Can we tap into more innovation? And ironically, this is what's so interesting. There's a lot of people who are like, yay, science. They got this vaccination out so quickly. And then I go, hey, maybe we want to look at this some more. And they say, I'm anti-science, I'm anti-innovation. I don't believe in people's capacity to do something quickly. And it's the complete opposite. I do believe in people's abilities to innovate.
Yeah.
I do believe in the ability to do things in a timely fashion. I just don't trust the people who are doing that right now.
Yeah, and a lot of people might not realize that there can be good reason to not have that trust, or that we shouldn't just say, well, we innovated and that's beautiful, especially at this moment in time. Like I say, you embody the reality that humans are capable of anything, or I shouldn't say absolutely anything because someone's going to hit me for that, but they're capable of a lot, right? And you say, okay, great. But is that the world that I'm seeing right now? And can I take a step back and ask myself that question without just sort of throwing my bias on everything? And the answer is yes, you can. It's not that hard when you face yourself and say, can I objectively take a look at the world? Can I objectively listen to different things? It's like, yes, you can. It may not be 100% objective, but you can get pretty damn close, right? And that takes self-awareness. That takes taking a step back, taking a breath, and knowing what's going on. And when you look at that, you go, well, you have all these people saying, hey guys, something going on with the vaccines and we need to take a look at it. It doesn't mean they're saying all these vaccine makers are horrible. They're saying we may not have accounted for everything. And that's okay. There's 7 billion people that each of them have a different constitution within their body. They might react differently to a vaccine. That's okay, right? So how can we adjust? Why is that so bad? I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds like science to me. Sounds like thinking. Okay. Joe, we could talk for hours. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to add some edits and put, because the one thing I really do want to show people are the articles that you got fact-checked that now, 10 months later, a year later, 5 years later, are pretty common knowledge and are accepted. So I'll get that from you. And yeah, thank you so much.
Perfect. Sounds great. Yeah, thank you so much for this. This was a great conversation.
Awesome.